So today I'd like to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Dr. Bryce Beamer. He's SSRC, the Social Science Research Center Council, Trans-Regional Research Fellow on Inter-Asian Contexts and Connections. So Bryce has been a really good friend of mine for many years. So my fondest memories of doing fieldwork in Myanmar with Bryce, just riding bikes around Mandalay, playing pool in an old hotel, just looking for anything to do after the electricity went out. And just trying to just have fun and stay sane as grad students doing field work on zero money in Mandalay. So his bio, Bryce Beamer has a PhD in Southeast Asian history from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he also studied world history and comparative slavery. He is currently, as I said, the SSRC Trans-Regional Research Fellow for Inter-Asian Contexts and Connections. Professor Beamer, that I have here, held previous positions as the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Comparative World History at Colby College in America, and as a research professor at Sogong University, where he edited Trans, a journal devoted to transnational research on the Southeast Asia region. His research is on the transcultural ramifications of slave gathering, warfare in mainland Southeast Asia and Northeast India, with a special focus on enslaved artisans, religious rituals, and processes of creolization and cultural exchange. The Fulbright Hayes and a Watomol Foundation grant for research in South Asia funded his research, which was conducted in 3 countries, Thailand, Burma, and Manipur in India, over a 2-year period, and that's when we were hanging out during that period. His PhD was awarded the 2014 Best Dissertation Prize by the World History Association. So the World History Association in the world went through so many dissertations and chose his, and that's why I can't wait for the book to come out. It's going to be really good. His publication, his article, Southeast Asian Slavery and Slave Gathering Warfare as a Vector for Transcultural Transmission, The Case of Burma and Thailand, received several academic awards for its innovative research methods, and it's one that I use in my course, History and Society of Asia, every semester. And before I hand the mic over to Bryce, I just wanted to announce next week's lecture will be at the same time, 4 to 5:30, also here, AC2, but on the 6th floor. And the title is Rohingya Crisis in Myanmar. And the speaker will be Dr. James Gomez, who's the Regional Director of Southeast Asia and the Pacific of Amnesty International. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to Dr. Bryce Beamer.
Thanks. Thank you.
And let me know if you need me to turn off lights or anything.
Sure,
it's
maybe
okay.
just for a movie at the end.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's great. That was a nice summary of my approach to my work. Slavery in Southeast Asia functioned quite differently than slavery did in the Atlantic world. Low population densities in Southeast Asia meant that there was always abundant farmland ringing capital cities, but quite low populations. And so warfare was often about the capture of people and not seizing land. In fact, you would go, the way fighting usually played out in the pre-colonial period was there'd be long periods of siege warfare to try to starve a city so that they would surrender, and then a kind of scooping up of the people and taking them back to your home capital for resettlement, and usually just leaving that city be, right? There was no need for kind of territorial expansion. So warfare was often about this kind of fighting and capturing people. My notion was that if there's this kind of constant influx of captured people, what were the cultural consequences of that, right? Cities in Southeast Asia were filled up with war captives from your rival neighbors. And more interestingly still, is this wasn't a region of kind of plantation economies, right? Or slaves weren't used for like the production of goods that were for sale. So people weren't put into these types of jobs, right? So kind of like, say, cotton or tobacco, the things that you think of in America. Instead, people were lined up according to skills that they already had. And the chronicles have all kinds of details of we captured 50 kinds of skilled artisans. We captured silversmiths and elephant veterinarians and silk weavers and dancers and people who were quite skilled at the frying of food, right? There would be all kinds of different funny things in the list. People who could color hair. And you would take them back and you would put them then into the royal service of the kingdom doing that. And my, initial research was on, how does that end up playing out then in terms of art and culture? If a group of Burmese painters suddenly incorporated, who are owned by the king, if suddenly incorporated into that group are 50 captured painters from Thailand, and that's kind of something that we'll look at today, how does painting change? How laterally then does kind of cultural ideas move between these groups? So slaves don't show up often in the kind of texts in Southeast Asia. Like there's a pride of capturing them, so they're mentioned then, and then there will be certain legal documents by the king as to where he put them to work, and then they kind of disappear from the scene. So they're subalterns. But there's something about a subaltern artisan, right? I call it a kind of peculiar subalternity. Because while they didn't write about themselves, and we don't see much written about them, they left us things, right? They made silver chalices, they painted temples, they molded Buddha images. And so it's possible then to look at the material culture of the kingdom and to look and see what were the influences of captives on those cultures, right? To kind of get out of our traditional sources. So this is kind of what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll show you kind of two things. First, kind of the fun research I did on painting, just because for people who aren't familiar with Southeast Asia, it's a good kind of visual representation of what I do. And then if there's time remaining, I'll show you a ceremony, which shows a kind of fusion in the culture of the captives. So basically I'm looking at a particular period, quite famous to Burmese historians and Burma studies people in general, which is that after 1752, there's this huge explosion of slave-gathering warfare in Burma. And this is just a map that I made to kind of show you all of the areas that the Burmese invaded and took slaves from that were quite different from the Burmese homeland, which is here in the dry zone of Upper Burma. So war captives from Laos, from Thailand, from up here in Manipur, which is now part of India, and even from China, were all kind of taken back in numbers as high as the tens of thousands back to Burma. The fall of Ayutthaya, which is the one we're going to look at now, which is when the capital of Thailand was sacked, the Burmese say they took 100,000 war captives. The Thais, in their chronicles, say that 30,000 were taken. I would guess it's some number in between, but these are tens of thousands of people in a time period when a capital city might have 150,000 to 250,000 people. Tens of thousands of war captives coming in is a significant increase in the population. So the comparative study of slavery is quite Eurocentric, and this will be just the only bit of reading I'm going to do, but there's certain kind of steps I think that one needs to take or one needs to think about in order to think comparatively about slavery. Especially because one of the reasons research on slavery hasn't taken place in Southeast Asia is because Southeast Asian historians, based on a conference that kind of happened in the 80s, decided that being captured in war and being kind of held in an unfree state in Southeast Asia wasn't something that could be called slavery. So in a sense it was defined out of existence, and therefore wasn't a kind of category for study in Southeast Asia. So one of the big things that I'm trying to do in my own research is to make discussions of slave systems and to think about slavery in Southeast Asia in more open ways. The new Journal of Global Slavery, which is just 2 or 3 issues old, is devoted to the project of comparing global slaveries. In its inaugural issue, Kostas Vasopoulos argues that the global study of slavery is stymied by this widespread notion among Americanists and others that slavery has an essence, in quotes, which is shaped by typologies such as chattel status in the law, systematic prejudice, violence and cruelty, and natal alienation, or the active destruction of the slave's cultural identity. These typologies inform what Vasopoulos describes as a taxonomic imperative, a compulsion to separate what can truly be called slavery from exploitative labor systems that must be called something else. This taxonomic dividing line correlates tightly to the history of plantation slavery in the Americas, and breaking away from it is the first and most important step towards the larger project of studying slavery on a global level. In the 2006 book, Slavery and South Asian History, Indrani Chatterjee puts forward a more polemical take on this same issue. Scholarship on Atlantic slavery, she argues, established a hegemonic and Eurocentric definition of slavery, conceptually married to the events of Western history. And this Eurocentric model compels scholars to treat non-Western forms of unfree labor as some other thing. By defining these highly subjugated peoples outside of the Atlantic as not slaves, Chatterjee argues, their historical experiences are damned to a double silence. The first because, as highly subjugated people, they are historical subalterns, right? We don't have very many texts about them. They don't get written about. The second silence is because their status as not slaves casts them outside the zone of scholarly interest. There are no rich comparative studies of servants or subordinated clients or dependents, no audience for these kind of studies, and no theories to draw upon. The book Slavery in South Asian History and Vassopoulos agree that we need to expand our conceptual range of slavery and conceptualize slavery as a diverse phenomenon, in which the Atlantic plantation is an important model, but not the only model for understanding this global phenomenon. So of course this is easier said than done, but I see two paths forward. So this is from my own thinking about the topic. There's really two paths forward for the study of global and comparative slavery. The first is to examine slavery through an economistic lens, and the second is to understand slavery as a locus point for cultural exchange. So I'll discuss cultural possibilities in my talk when I start looking at the slides again. So in doing this, we can create more intellectual space for comparing global slaveries by stepping back from slavery and looking at it in its most abstract form, as an economic strategy employed by the state, elites, or some other group to extract and exploit unfree labor within a particular society. If we remain in tune with slavery as a system of unfree labor and as an economic strategy, it affords us what I would call 4 insights that can assist us in comparative teaching and research. 1, recognizing the way that slavery is articulated to the economy and economic strategies suggests that we should stage our comparisons across forms of economic organization. So slavery is profoundly different in hunter-gatherer societies than in agrarian ones, than in the urban trading ports on the Bay of Bengal, than on the American plantation system that was feeding cotton to Britain's industrial factories. 2, this also helps us to recognize the contingency within slave systems. Because slavery is responsive to economic forces, economic transformations can drive change in the system and culture of slavery. So it is not a static category. It changes over time. 3, we can expand our conceptual range of unfreedom by thinking about slavery as an economic strategy. We can bring it into conversation with affiliated systems of labor exploitation that have similar economic goals. So we can compare it then to bonded labor, coolie labor, corvée labor, serfdom, and even prison labor and the caste system in India. 4, it magnifies the need for decentering American plantation slavery from our working definition of slavery. The labor of American slaves was embedded in the processes of industrialization and the creation of our modern economic world. Their skilled labor, especially as producers of cotton, fed the factory system and the mass production of textiles. It is a crucial phase in the global history of slavery, but it becomes a very poor yardstick for evaluating the 10,000 or so years of human history preceding the rise of modern capitalism. So this call to think abstractly or economistically about slavery and other forms of labor exploitation is a strategy for taking 1 step back in order to take 2 steps forward. And my discussion up to this point can be summarized as follows. The / between the binary categories of slavery and freedom and unfree and free was not etched by a knife blade. Rather, that forward slash represents this kind of vast gray area, and which many kinds of exploitative labor practices are located. And this gray zone is the appropriate working space for studying and comparing unfree labor practices and slavery worldwide. So the ideas I've expressed so far are fundamental to my research, but the research itself is devoted to cultural history and processes of cultural exchange that are embedded in the history of long-distance slavery. It is an old observation in the field of American slavery that while the slave is property in the law, their relationship with their owners and other non-slaves are bound by human intimacy. And it is very possible for cultural practices then to cross from one side to the other. In The Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy described the intercultural positionality of the slave and the capacity of slaves and their descendants to create these contact zones between different cultures and histories. And James Brooks in Captives and Cousins, so these are two kind of classics in slavery studies, used the term cultural interpenetration to describe the process by which two hostile societies grow more similar over time by absorbing the hybrid cultural characteristics of the slaves that they capture from one another. However, the greatest inspiration from my work comes from creolization theory, and creolization theory is a conceptual framework first promoted by Francophone Caribbean intellectuals as a tool for locating the agency and cultural potency of Atlantic slave communities. Creolization theory posits that the experience of slavery, so violent capture, being uprooted and transported to a distant land, the destruction of old social bonds and the creation of new ones, had profound transcultural implications. The process of rerouting oneself in a foreign land catalyzes cultural reinvention that necessarily draws from the dominant culture of the slaveholders and from the cultures of other captured communities. These newly created hybrid cultural and artistic forms have the potential to then travel from slaves to non-slave communities, transforming the culture at large. The creolization model is one of complex dialogical exchange in which enslavement culturally transforms enslaved people who in turn transform the culture of their captives. So my own work harnesses creolization theory to subaltern studies and this kind of call to study world history from below from Antoinette Burton, because it allows us to see slaves as potent agents for creative invention and transculturation, with the power and ability to generate history-changing cultural and artistic practices. Creolization theory also comes with kind of a research toolbox of sorts. It posits that this generative creativity is most easily located in the areas of cultural life where slaves had a level of autonomy vis-a-vis their owners. Thus, it is most apparent in the kinds of performance and artistic activities, in religious practice and belief, in song, music, dance, poetry, foodways, and sometimes dress and even architecture. This insight informed my own research on war slaves in Burma, in which I looked across these very same sets of practices to try to locate similar kind of hybridizing or transcultural exchanges. So I want to talk about a dance form that developed in Thailand and then moved to Burma after the invasion in 1767, in which the Burmese seized captives from Ayutthaya in the tens of thousands and brought them to Thailand. One of the most important things, who's gone to Thailand? Okay, so you must have been probably duck marched to see the Ramayana at some point, right? I mean, everyone kind of does. So it's quite famous for these kind of masks. It's called a masked dance, with the different masks and their designs representing the different characters in the story. So we have Rama in green, his brother Lakshmana, his wife Sita, the ogre king Ravana. These are kind of ogre generals in the army, and this is Hanuman, the monkey king, right? Does everybody know the Ramayana story generally? Okay, I mean, just shortly, it is the story in which the ogre Ravana falls in love at a distance with Sita, kidnaps her and takes her to Sri Lanka to live. her husband-to-be, Rama, with the assistance of his brother Lakshmana, right, go to rescue her. On the way, they come across a kind of monkey allies, and a monkey army joins with them, and it ends with a huge battle, right, in which Sita is captured, retaken from the ogre army, and the ogres are destroyed. So it has a kind of potent visuality in Thailand. It comes across as this dance form in which you have things like movement, costumes, masks, and this kind of combat style that all kind of mix together to be a kind of very special representation of the Ramayana. So here is this kind of very slow gestural dancing style. And it's similar to other dances around the world in which certain gestures actually have meanings, right? So there's a way that you can read the dance through the gestures. It's also known for kind of how slow and graceful it is, which really distinguishes it from Burmese dance, which is really kind of rapid and acrobatic and doesn't contain the same kind of gestural meanings. The other thing, for the purposes of my talk, that I want to talk about is this kind of highly stylized dancing, in which victory in combat is represented by this kind of very acrobatic balancing that's done to show who is defeating who within the fight. And to actually, they'll go as many as 3 people high, and they have to actually regulate their breathing in order to kind of achieve these different dance postures, right? And this is something also, again, very particular to Thai dancing. So you have this kind of strong visuality that comes with the masks. You have these kind of costumes, too, in Thailand that are fairly constant across time. So these are rubbings of stone plaques that date to the Ayutthaya period. So we can see this kind of costume style. And what I really want you to note are the kind of crowns, the epaulets that are on the outside here, the way that people are wearing these kind of fitted bodices, and then this kind of hanging decoration here, which originally was representing armor, but now it's a kind of heavily embroidered cloth. In Thailand, the kind of visuality that comes with the Ramayana dancing also leaked into other artistic representations. So there are ogres in all kinds of different Buddhist stories. And the ogres that we see in the dances also show up in paintings of ogres outside of the Ramayana. So this is the Vidura Jataka. And in this story, and this is a painting that dates before the fall of Ayutthaya, so to the 1750s. So this is a quite old, which is why it's decayed. But in it, an ogre is sent to assassinate a past life representative of the Buddha, who is this great sage that is kind of leading a kingdom quite successfully by being an advisor to the king. So this ogre assassin is sent then to kill him, and does it in a variety of different ways. One is to force him to grab onto his magical flying horse, and he takes the sage up into the sky to kind of terrify him. And he keeps noticing that the sage, as a past life representative of the Buddha, is sort of unperturbed and doesn't fear his own death. And so the ogre then realizes that he's a divine being and asks for a kind of lesson then. And the great sage Vidura then, represented here, gives him a Dharma lesson, and the ogre then converts on the spot to Buddhism and sets him free. And you can just see here that the same kind of dancerly costume also shows up then in art. The other interesting place where we see ogres represented in Thai art are in representations of the renunciation of the Buddha, so the moment at which the Buddha leaves the palace to take his vow of poverty, right, to give his worldly renunciation. And in Buddhist mythology, Mara descends then to try to stop the renunciation because he knows that the Buddha's renunciation from his princely life in the palace is going to lead to Mara's downfall. So there's an attempt to kind of stop this. And you can see this representation of Mara is again very similar to an ogre. So this kind of artistic style that's in the dancing kind of flows through the art of Thai, flows through Thai art So now let's talk about this point, because now what I would like to discuss is that in Burma, there were no artistic representations of the Ramayana before the arrival of the time. It existed as a kind of poem and song, but it was never painted, it was never danced, right? So everyone knew this story and loved this story, but it wasn't attached to an artistic tradition. And so what I'm going to show you now in Burmese art is something that I would call like the James Bond or Harry Potter effect. Because you would have read Harry Potter and have this in your imagination, this kind of great understanding of what the characters look like and what the settings look like. And then the visual language of the film will have this quality of erasing all of that, right? And replacing it, right? Because the visual language is so potent, right? That it's kind of captivating to us for these stories that we know. And it's even actually kind of hard to go backwards, right? To even think about the Harry Potter that we read before we saw the movie. Something similar is going to happen in Burma. So here's a court painting. Soon after the capture of the Ramayana dancing troupe, we just start seeing Ramayana dancing troupes in all these court paintings that show up in Burma. This one is from sort of around the 1830s, 1840s. And we see the king and the queen of Burma observing a Ramayana dancing troupe. And here's another example, again, the king and queen of Burma watching the Ramayana dance. And we can see the costumes and the masks, right, are part of it. And here's something that we might just expect. You know, you capture a dancing troupe, you start employing them to dance in your palace. But it's going to move beyond that. There are going to be ripples that come out of it. We start seeing the dancers portrayed in these really interesting manuscripts that get produced in Burma, which are paintings of parades, right? Parades and kind of big spectacles are important in Southeast Asian politics, and they would sometimes be recorded by painters, and they would be these kind of folios that would spread out to 30 feet in length that would just detail everyone in the parade. And we start seeing then Yodia Ati, which are Yodia musicians, right? So it's labeled, so we have our captured, or the descendants of captured Yodia musicians, and then we have Yodia Aka, so the dancers from Ayutthaya, right? Represented here in their costumes and wearing their masks as they're kind of being paraded through the streets, right? So this play is in the palace, and then it's kind of coming out of the palace. And just here's another one from a different set of painters in which you see the same kind of process. These Yodia dancers being incorporated into these kind of big royal festivals. But now let's move into unexpected changes, because what you see happening is in all of the 10 royally sponsored arts, or the 10 most important arts that the palace funds, we start seeing artisans incorporating Ramayana scenes and Ramayana characters into their artwork. So here we see on top of silver work, Rama dancing. Here's an ogre on glazeware, on pottery, lacquerware, wood carving, glass stucco work. The Ramayana just starts spreading then from dance into the other art forms. The famous kind of Kalaga, which is this kind of tapestry that tells stories, starts having Ramayana figures in it. So here's Hanuman fighting the crab. These scenes start showing up. One of the most interesting ones is that fighting style that I told you about, right? Where characters kind of stand up on each other's shoulders, and temple wood carvers really start to become fascinated by this. And a lot of the kind of temples that come up in the 1850s and before start showing people in combat, right? And here's the mask then from the Ramayana, standing up or perching up on each other's shoulders, right? So there's something kind of challenging and kind of marvelous for wood carvers. So there starts then to be a kind of reimagining now. So this is the Ramayana moving out, but now there's another kind of ripple of change which is interesting, which is the kind of cultural notion of subhuman creatures, or kind of ogre-like creatures. In Burma, the tradition of representing ogres draws on a kind of ape or simian characteristics. They're always kind of drawn as hairy. They kind of have these teeth that protrude from lipless mouths. They're without necks. And this is in contrast to kind of how subhuman characters are represented in Thai art, which is as kind of crocodile characteristics, is how they're described. So kind of crocodilian eyes, the kind of sharp teeth that come up from the lower part of the mouth, and then the green, smooth skin. So here are temple paintings, right? And here's the kind of ape-like characteristic I want you to show. They're not totally fixed, but these are kind of 16th to 18th century paintings that predate the arrival of the Thais in 1767. And we can see ogres, right, with their kind of simian qualities, right? And these are representations of Mara at the Renunciation, and this is Mara when he's attacking the Buddha, and then these are ogres that are in the army. But we start seeing this period of experimentation going on in Burmese art. So here is an interesting painting in which the ogre is presented in this frame in the kind of traditional Burmese style. And over here, still in the traditional Burmese style, but now wearing a Thai dancer's costume. You can see this kind of period of transition. But we can really see it if we look at the Punaka story that I told you about earlier, right? The ogre assassin with the magical flying horse. Here's a representation of that story from the late 18th century. So again, before the Thais come, right? With these kind of, monkey qualities. Here's the magical flying horse. And here it is shortly after, right? Moving into a dancing costume, having the kind of crocodile-like characteristics. Skin is not painted green in this one, but it's still kind of a transition period. But we finally can move to this manuscript from 1837, which represents in Burmese Buddhist art the renunciation scene that I showed you earlier, right? In which Mara descends to halt the Buddha's renunciation. And we can see now that with about 90 years separating them, the renunciation in Thai art and the renunciation in Burmese art are almost simultaneous, or almost exactly similar. And just to give you a sense of the transition, here's Mara in the renunciation before Thai influence. Here is the Thai style from the Ayutthaya period, and then here it is in Burma after influence, after the Thai influence. But then there's another kind of unexpected change, right? And that's one in which ogres start being represented as human beings wearing masks. And this is something you do not see in Thailand. In Thailand, the mask of the ogre, right, the ogre mask in the Ramayana dance is what an ogre in the wild is supposed to look like, right? But the maskiness that comes over from Thailand really kind of affects Burmese art. So there are a lot of representations then of a kind of dancer's body or just a regular human body with a mask on it to represent an ogre. And this ends up interestingly affecting the Vidura Jataka representation, because the mask starts to be incorporated into the telling of that story. So here we have the ogre listening to the Dharma talk, right? Here he is trying to kill, Punaka is trying to kill Vidura the sage. And here's Punaka now listening to the sage's Dharma talk. And here he is at the moment of conversion. And now the mask has this symbolic meaning, which is that it rises up on the head of the ogre to show their conversion and their kind of acceptance of a Buddhist humanity, right? It shows the kind of potential for redemption within, right, as the mask slides up. Something that you don't see in tellings of the story before the mask comes. And this spreads into another place which is quite interesting, which is amongst the kind of flower-eating ogre or not worshipping practices that you find in the Burmese countryside. So knots are local deities, and there tends to be a lot of variation between how they're worshipped in different villages. And so there are many places in Burma where you'll find villages that worship flower-eating ogres. And so these are ogres that have converted to Buddhism, and so they've given up being cannibals, eating human beings, and they've switched to an entirely vegetarian diet, which is why they're called flower-eating ogres, and they are invariably represented as women wearing dancers' masks on the top of their head, right? So it kind of even has moved into these conceptions of village religious practice. Again, something you don't see in Thailand, right? This is the unexpected kind of ripple, the kind of hybridization, transculturation of two cultures coming into contact, and all kinds of unexpected changes coming out of it. And I suspect, though I don't know, that these parades, right, that went on during the Kolmbao period, in which Thai dancers were marching around through the capital city wearing the masks on the top of their head, had a kind of transformative effect, maybe, on the way that knot statues, these kind of local spirit statues, were made. This is one of the most famous ones. Sandamukhi, who is the predicted the building of Mandalay, and her shrine is at the top of Mandalay Hill, kind of looking out onto the city that she had predicted in the past. So there's a way that creolization, how much time do I have?
Oh, 20 minutes.
20 minutes?
Yeah,
Good.
15
Okay,
minutes.
that's kind of where I want to be. So this is just to wrap up the first half, this kind of art thing that I hope can kind of move you through in an interesting visual way what I want to talk about. But there is a kind of interesting roadmap amongst these kind of francophone intellectuals, that Caribbean intellectuals that kind of came up with the notion of creolization theory. And it is that we can't actually tell the history of a location without also telling the history of where all the people that live in that location came from, right? That, you know, a place that is a cosmopolitan city space, a cosmopolitan space that is filled with people from all over the world, contains the histories of the places that they came from, because those histories are interactional, right? So any kind of location, especially a location settled by slaves, also has to simultaneously tell this history of dislocation, right? How the people who came there, and what they carried with them, and how it interacted in the space, so that the local and the global are tied together. And they use these kind of lovely metaphors, right? That it is a world diffracted and recomposed. They talk about something glass being broken and then being put back together in a mosaic. The other way they describe history is history needs to be written as a braid, because everything, all these different groups of people come, but then they're kind of twined together. And this is the kind of historical practice I'm trying to promote in my own work, and that I've kind of taken on board in my own thinking. So there's two sides to my research. One is the culture that gets introduced by captives. So that's what we've just looked at. The other side is, and we'll look a bit more at that, but the other side is how are captives transformed by their new location. Because they can't be, you know, a war captive, a slave is ripped out of their natal homeland and put somewhere else. And that is, as I described earlier, transformative, because in order to kind of rebuild their culture, they're going to end up taking on things from their neighbors. So I want to look at a different group now for my last few minutes. And this is a kind of a very little known part of the world, Manipur, which is part of northeast India, which in fact, if you've said to many Indians that I've just went to Manipur, they would ask you what country that is, because Northeast India is so remote from the average Indian that many of them have never been. They don't know it's part of India. It's kind of this interesting space. And it stretches, it's basically like a little arm that stretches over the top of Bangladesh and then borders Burma. Right? And one of the most important states here is Manipur. So here, Manipur. Manipur had this period of kind of very powerful, very potent political period, and this had a lot to do with their cavalry they developed all kinds of kind of very innovative cavalry techniques that even though they were quite a small state, they could penetrate deeply into Burma and do lots of kind of raiding and invasions that were quite destabilizing to Burma. And in fact, partly due to that, Burma collapses in the 1750s and then reemerges as the Komban, and it's the Komban that expands its power out into the rest of Southeast Asia. Between 1819 and 1826 is this period in Manipuri history, and again, I went to Manipur just to remind you, and it was this multi-year long occupation of Manipur, in which its population, which might have been up around 150,000, was reduced to perhaps 6,000 by the end of the war. The British end up kind of pushing the Burmese out and just find a quite low population there. So this invasion by the Burmese ended up cleaving the Manipuri population. Tens of thousands of them are taken as war captives to Burma, but others flee out of Burma towards what is then kind of British Assam, and then into these other independent states that were sort of north and west of Manipur. There ends up being a kind of interesting cultural traditions that follow out of this, and one that kind of reflects Southeast Asian studies, interestingly. The Manipuri as cavalry members were so well respected in Burma, the ones that were captured on the battlefield, that they were allowed to wear their Manipuri uniforms within the Burmese army. And these were kind of really fantastic uniforms, so there's a lot of British drawings of them. So here we have kind of the Burmese cavalry, but here's another elite, kind of elite officer from Manipur, and you can see he's still in his Manipuri costume. The reason that the Manipuris were such excellent cavalrymen was they had this game where they chased a ball around and hit it with mallets, right? Puli. When, as I said, the country was cleaved, right? And this is interestingly kind of impacts on Hong Kong's history, right? Because the British, in order to break China's monopoly over tea, are experimenting with tea in Assam. And so we're now guarding, or kind of in Assam, guarding that borderland from the Burmese, right? So there are British cavalrymen up in this area of Northeast India. And when they encounter these refugees from Manipur and befriend them, this game passes from Manipuris to John F. Shearer, right, the father of polo. They start organizing games. Eventually, they take Manipuri cavalrymen down to Calcutta, and they do demonstration games. It gets picked up by the British military, and then when soldiers are kind of moved then around the British Empire, they take this game with them. So this is part of the global study. But it also goes the other way. Polo becomes a popular game in Burma as well. It's introduced in both directions by the war captives and by the refugees. But the other group of people that gets taken from Manipur are court Brahmins. One of the interesting things about Buddhist kingdoms is that they need the kind of ritual input from Brahmins, right? Crowning ceremonies, certain sacred ceremonies about like the 1-year birthday of a young prince, haircuts, all of these different aspects. They need to keep time. They need to find the sacred dates in which to invade someone or to start a big civic project. In other words, Brahmins are essential to the working life of a Buddhist palace. And interestingly, in Burma, most of the Brahmins were war captives, taken either from Arakan, which I'm not talking about in this talk, or Manipur. So they become very important within palace life. And their communities are right outside the main palace gates, important palace gates in Mandalay. So this is a group of Manipuri Brahmins. And what I'm going to show you is this interesting mix. Because Brahmins in Manipur and Brahmins in Bengal in general at that time practiced the Ramayana without dance. It was only a musical tradition. And it was played on these kind of simple instruments, which are gongs, right? This is actually a Brahmin band in that parade, and I should have pointed it to you earlier, with these long drums, and then they play these kind of clarinets and gongs and hand cymbals. So they would sit then and play these instruments and they chant the Ramayana, and they do it at length. So often these things go for 8 or 9 or 10 hours, right? But it's a poetic recitation of the Ramayana without any visuality to it, without any dancing. But the Ramayana community, or the Brahmin community, was quite close in Mandalay to the Thai dancing quarter. In fact, they're really only separated by about 6 blocks. And this ended up having a profound effect on how they present the Ramayana. And this will draw then on the first half of my talk. So I'll just, oops. And maybe the lights can go off for this. So this is an all-girls amateur troupe putting on the Ramayana for their community. And right at this point, you can hear what was the original music, right? It's kind of a chanting and gongs and drums. But now, instead of just sitting in a circle, in the center of the circle, they have this dancing that goes on, which they call Thai-style Manipuri dancing that they learned, right? But action sequences require something different than the chanting, and so they also hire Burmese musicians to come in and play orchestral combat music. And this orchestral music actually comes out of Thai-Burmese fusion itself, right? So we're starting to see Burmese mixed with Thai, mixed with Manipuri. We see them trying to do in this scene the kind of acrobatic standing, but it's an amateur group, so they don't quite get there. So modern entertainment kind of also is moving into this, right? This kind of So the reason I include this end dance is that you get to see this kind of lateral movement now, right, between this kind of culture that's introduced from Thailand and these kind of these Brahmins that are captured from Manipur. It does this thing that happens in slavery, which is it creates an impossible borderline, right? Burma and Thailand do not border each other in reality, right? But in Mandalay, they do. There are these two communities that live just 6 blocks from each other, and culture could be exchanged between these two sets of people that could not be exchanged outside of the context of slavery. The second interesting thing is, if we talk about people kind of being shattered and rebuilding their culture, this whole invitational scene, right? This is a kind of space where you can be created in the Ramayana in which people are being invited from all corners of the world to come and see Rama marry Sita. But the corners of the world for Manipuri Brahmins are very interesting, right? It is Bengal, because that's where they migrated from when they moved to Manipur. It's Manipur, because that's where they were captured from. It's the hill tribe peoples who live in the mountains above Mandalay, who they now are in contact with. It's the BURMA'S, right, who are their next door neighbors. And then it's the fantasy world of Bollywood and American Hollywood entertainment. Like, this is this newly created global space, right, that gets represented, the kind of hybridity or creolization that comes through. But the real kind of creolization is just in thinking through the mixture that's in this play, because it's sung in kind of Sanskrit and Old Bengali poetics, right? So the ritual language of the Brahmins, right? This is what's getting chanted. But when the Burmese music is playing, we get Burmese language lyrics, right? When the actors speak and lift their masks, they're speaking in Manipuri, all right? So all of this kind of interesting global mixing showing up in the kind of entertainment world, right? Again, the kind of crazy slavery is cruel and horrible, but also at the same time culturally generative in this way that we need to comprehend as well, and to just gives us a kind of deeper sense too of what is born out of these kind of cross-cultural contacts. And it lets us see, you know, in this time in which ethno-nationalism is really becoming a big part of Southeast Asia in general, and Burma in particular. The kind of history I'm trying to tell is about the building blocks of Burmese culture, because the building blocks of Burmese culture are built out of the very same neighbors that ethno-nationalism is making them hate. Okay? And this is always true, right? You absorb from your enemies, you absorb from the people that you captured. All of this conflict can't also help but transform like the culture in which it's generated. Right? And this becomes a kind of very different way of looking at Southeast Asian cultural history. So that's it. Thank you very much. I really look forward to any questions.
Some of my fondest memories of doing field work are going around with him with Bryce, because anything you would see on the side of the road, you would just make the driver stop and just record it. And like things I would have never experienced are thanks to you, because you would just get like, you'd want to get the, and then we'd have to sit through for the entire ceremony, and I'd be like waiting, but still it was worth it when I look back on it. Does anybody have any questions to start off with? Mark?
Thanks very much. I apologize for coming in a little bit late. I wanted to take you up on the point you made when I just came in about the Southeast Asian view of this. And again, my apologies if I missed something, but you know, besides, you know, some decisions by historians and so on, there's obviously the imperialism, anti-imperialism kind of framework, right? And you know, I think understandably there's a distinction that people in the region and elsewhere outside of the imperial powers of the time would want to make between, you know, the kind of thing that goes on between countries at war, these war captives things, and what goes under imperialism. So depending on how you look at imperialism and how important it is as a break in human history. I mean, one example of the kind of argument you can make, if you think about Hannah Arendt's argument about racism and how that's a product of imperialism. So there are some distinctions. I'm not claiming that your argument about slavery and the importance of comparison is not valid, but I'm just saying I think we need to take seriously the point about the distinctive character of slavery under imperialist conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And a related point to that is the question of cultural hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
And we know when slavery occurs with African slaves in the West, you have this tremendous sense of cultural superiority.
Mm-hmm.
And even though, of course, you do get these Creole forms, and then, of course, in the U.S. case, in terms of, think about music and a lot of other cultural constructions that occur and take place. But nonetheless, that is, basically, if you think about, the blues and jazz and so on, that's
Mm-hmm.
considered inferior also in the 20th century because of its association with former African slaves or African slaves. So I think the cultural superiority issue is important because in the Southeast Asian context, obviously, that wasn't a factor. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You could take your captives from Ayutthaya and you took them quite seriously. And the final point, sorry, this is more of a comment.
No, that's absolutely a perfect point.
Yeah, yeah. And then just finally, just the comparison in Western history that occurs to me is, of course, the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And they bring in, depending on where they're warring at that point, but they bring in some groups that they consider, they can learn from culturally.
Right.
And that strikes me as a kind of interesting kind of comparison in the context. But I do see some important distinctions between the modern African slavery story and what you're talking about.
Right. Which I don't want to deny, but then how do we, I feel like there's a way that we can take your criticism and turn it back towards the kind of point I'm making. Because how is it that we distinguish this kind of incredible racism and cruelty that's built into, slavery in the Atlantic world without a comparative framework, right? That is a kind of statement that we can make through comparativity. And there's something, I think one of the things that's now only just coming out in, analysis of slavery, especially like, say, Sven Beckert's Cotton book, which made a big splash recently, which is how embedded Atlantic slavery was in the rise of the West. What is that slavery? That slavery is so different from the rest of world history because it's first embedded in the rise of global commodities, right? So it's sugar, tobacco, and then it becomes embedded in the crops that are part of the Industrial Revolution, right? So then it moves on to cotton. So why is American slavery so different, right? It's because it's embedded in the factory, the rise of the factory, and in the industrial economy. And when we start recognizing that, we can see these kind of aspects of kind of cruelty in it, right? This mechanization, right? That this is just this huge industry that's feeding the cotton mills of England. And so it's not as much, as it was always studied before, a kind of throwback to something medieval. It was actually kind of embedded in our own modernity. And it becomes then, like, if we make that, and this was kind of the point I was making, if we make that our standard for what slavery is, we've done something that's like we shouldn't as historians do, which is to take something that is a modern phenomenon and then say the past is less than that because it doesn't meet this particular standard, which it could not possibly have met because other forms of slavery predate the factory system. So that's why I'm saying we need a kind of comparativity that looks across economic systems, because that's where we can start seeing the linkages between the two. But I also do think that the cruelty and the exploitation is tied to the birth of capitalism, and that's kind of an important story to tell too about slavery. And that's the thing that I think is one of its major kind of separations. Have I convinced you?
No, I see your point.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to look at it from the, obviously, the other factors are nationalism
Right.
way, but I think that's, you know, because Southeast Asia is so much shaped by the imperial project, I think, I mean, if you want to understand some of the sensitivities, that doesn't deny the scientific rationale that you
Sure.
I mean, it's an old, social sciences too, you know, to what extent can you compare, but as you say, to work out the differences, the comparison is useful.
So I think I should put an explanation, or kind of an exclamation point on it, because I'm actually trying to bifurcate how we do our comparativity. Because I think that you should not compare American slavery to Southeast Asian slavery on economic terms, right? That argues for a separation. But there's something very similar about the cultural experience of slaves if we move into cultural study. Because slaves in Southeast Asia, just as slaves from Africa moved into the Americas, are people who were ripped from one cultural context and planted into another, and then being surrounded by other foreigners, right? And having to make a new life for themselves. And there I see it not problematic to do, I mean, I'm defending the core of my theory, but to take these ideas that developed for American slavery and then try to transport them to Southeast Asia to ask these new questions. And this larger, just to put a final point on this, I do think that the study of slavery outside of the Americas has been put into this kind of, I would call it an epistemological invisibility, right? You define slavery in a kind of very American context. You have this basically a Eurocentric definition, and anything that's not that is not slavery. And it's similar to the complaints that have been made all throughout academia about words like modernity, right? If you define modernity as something that is just married conceptually to what goes on in Europe economically and socially, then suddenly places like China were never modern, or Japan, or any of these other places. This is just a reversal of that. In that case, it's to look at something good or positive. In this case, it's to look at something negative. Like, negative things can also have these kind of Eurocentric definitions that we should challenge.
I'm wondering, what is the core of your definition of slavery? Is that unfree labor? Were these people unable to go back? Were they forced to stay there, or could they, if they, in the night, they could leave? Is there any evidence about that? Because abduction seems to be not necessary for slavery. If you see as modern slavery, many of the people who come into slavery voluntarily go into slavery, like sexual slavery, or the people who work in the Middle East and building these cities who are forced labor, basically. Yeah. So I was just wondering, what is the core of that definition of slavery? Is that unfree labor?
Right. So I don't. In my work, as you read through it, I do not call the people. I say that that warfare to take people is slave gathering warfare, right? Because they're taken in blood and violence. Often the husband is killed in the battle for the city, and it's the wife and the children that are taken. And they're often death marches, because there can be 500 miles through the jungle. And in the 3 or 4 documents that we have about these marches, babies at the breast die, old people die, anybody who's sick dies, and they're just left on the side of the road as people are marched along. So this to me is all comfortably kind of system of slavery. But once people are settled, to go more directly to your question, it's hard to call them slaves anymore. And at that point, I think it's best to call them war captives, because they're settled into these varieties of statuses within the society, some quite low, that we might be comfortable calling slaves, even with this notion lingering in the West, but others can be counselors to the kings and be given kind of large land to live on. And then that becomes kind of problematic. So at this point, I think captive becomes a better word for them, though that's something I'm a bit working through on my own. But none of them are free, right? They're all unfree, because they're all in law owned by the king and can't leave that service, and it's inheritable. So the children of court Brahmins become Brahmins, the children of goldsmiths become goldsmiths, silversmiths, and so on, and through to the low statuses. And there's laws that work like miscegenation laws, quite interestingly, because this labor system is so important to the kingdom. Silversmiths can't marry horse trainers right? Military archers can't marry pot makers. Like, there's a whole thing. And when people do get married, it actually went to kind of a state Supreme Court, and they would usually decide that the daughters have to go into one job and the sons have to go to another if they're going to allow the marriage. So this kind of policing is interesting in, too, that it ends up sometimes preserving the cultures over time, because you end up having this Thai dancing troupe. They have to marry each other and they can't marry out, and that dancing troupe quarter still has a few Thais in it left today, you know, after 150 years, you know, just because of this kind of intermarriage over time. I kind of danced around your question. I feel like the problem is you get trapped when you define it. And I would prefer to think about, you know, a Venn diagram, right? Because if you put this characteristics that we define as slavery, which is like it's an inheritable status, right? You're unfree, you're unpaid, you're treated with prejudice, right? So that's a nice little Venn diagram for slaves in the Americas, right? But that's also untouchables in the caste system, right? In that it's an inheritable status, that people are treated with prejudice, all of, right? And we have never thought of those as being comparable, except that untouchables in the caste system do, right? Because they often read African American history and make connections, right? And find Martin Luther King and Malcolm X to be really interesting, right? Thought, that kind of thought in that direction has been cultivated amongst untouchables. And I feel like that notion, right, which is that things overlap in interesting ways and there's different ways to work through levels of unfreedom comparatively, is kind of where I'm going intellectually, versus creating a fixed definition for slave and then coming up again with what's outside of it. Sure. Mm-hmm.
You start off by saying that in the whole of Southeast Asia, the population density is relatively low, so you have all this slave capturing. Yeah. But then if you look at, let's say, China, the central part of China, well, they actually, there are just many people and too many people in a way. So why continental Southeast Asia have a lack of people? But I think Indonesia also have Java also have a lack of people for a very long time. But what's the reason? But that drives all this slave capturing practice over the centuries.
So there's no great answer for that, but like demographic historians have really looked at it, and they seem to, but again, it's kind of a piecing together. It seems to be it's quite a harsh environment in terms of tropical diseases, which kind of kept population down. The other one is female autonomy, because women in the Southeast Asian past made the choice of how many kids to have, so that kept family sizes low. The endemic warfare about capturing people was not particularly good for keeping populations. And then it's an area of high natural disasters, right? So tend to be volcanoes, flooding, all of these kind of things, which with some regularity would have hurt populations. But like right now, all I'm doing is reciting to you this article by Baumgarten, who's an ecological historian, and these are his 5 main points. But it's all a bit obscure because there really aren't good sources for that. Census was something that Southeast Asian kingdoms didn't care about until the modern period. The only exception to that was Vietnam, which was following a Chinese model, and you can do interesting things with censuses there, but that's impossible in the countries that I look at. So it's not very convincing. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm just parroting to you what's the consensus opinion.
You say talk about Manipur and so on, and if you look into the Indian subcontinent, then the population density is definitely very, very different.
Yeah.
So it's a bit peculiar because, well, if you look at the climate and geography and so on, well, it's very interesting to see that why this part of Asia is particularly lack of manpower.
Right. I think so, right? And I think this is why people find the arguments a bit unconvincing, right? Though, I mean, I do think the female autonomy issue is kind of an important one, right? People seem to stop at 3 kids even in the past, and Europeans notice that about Southeast Asia. There are a few places that were exceptions to that, right? The Red River Delta, Java at certain times, Bali, right? These were places where the population got up around 1 million quite early in history. And then Angkor, when it was flourishing, now they think it had 1 million people. So this is sort of 12th, and then this like 8th to 12th century, it builds up to that number, and then they have a collapse. In that case, they're looking at like ecological reasons, that there's certain ways of farming in Southeast Asia where you could get the paddy up to support 1 million people, and then you're going to get a kind of a rapid decline. That's the theory for what happened in Angkor. So maybe that's another kind of force to look at too. But yeah, I mean, I can answer these questions for you, but I'm only parroting what I've read. Do you know what I mean? I don't have any interesting thinking on this beyond kind of what's out in the literature. Yeah.
So what accounts for some cultural exchanges and not others? Like, for example, in Burmese, there's no Thai loanwords, or are there?
There are, yeah.
Oh, okay.
A few.
So what factors, or what have you noticed any patterns in what gets what gets drawn from the certain captives, the Manipurians, and gets brought into
right
popular culture?
So the Thai loanwords show up. It's interesting where they show up. They show up in dance and music terminologies, and the music terminologies are really interesting because they're actually just meaningless sounds in Burmese to describe things that are descriptive words in Thai. So kinds of musical playing. So that's one. So because music was influential. There's stuff that comes along with dance, and then interestingly, there's like 20 foods in Burma that are loan words from Thai, and they tend to be desserts. And the theory about that is Burmese didn't use coconut milk to sweeten desserts, right? They used palm toddy, and there's just like a real alignment, like coconut desserts have Thai names or kind of Thai affiliated names. Yeah, so that's the other thing.
Okay.
And weirdly, fish sauce is the same in both languages, but it's not possible that the Thai introduced fish sauce to Burma. It doesn't seem possible. But Nambia and Nambla, it's the same. And Nambia doesn't contain meaning in Burmese, right? So somehow it comes over that way.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and then I only looked a little bit, because I don't speak Manipuri, I can't find them or notice them or anything. And there's a couple architectural terms for house building that are borrowed, right? But that's about it. Yeah, I have to say though, it's not a direction that I really looked at.
But you look at mostly at the art influence and the military. You're pointing out the Manipuri military. So that's
yeah.
your,
Well, I think there's like a bifurcation at what I look at. So I'm looking at like non-traditional sources for the cultural influences of the captives on Burma, right? So that ends up being silk weaving is a big one, military things. For the Thai, it's like some cooking, but the painting, dancing, music, and then there's kind of a break, and then I do ethnographic research in villages that consider themselves to be descendants of those people, and then that's when it flips around, and it looks then at the kind of cultural transformations, right, accommodation and assimilation into Burmese society. And in that case, it really does follow the what African American cultural historians would point to, which is religion, which is there's just a lot of hybridity in religious practice amongst captives who are trying to kind of adjust their old religious beliefs to the new Burmese one. And that's part of the thing that you'll see kind of in the daily life of these villages. Yeah.
If I could just follow up on Tom's question,
Yeah.
I mean, aren't you sort of proposing, unless I'm misunderstanding you, a sort of theory of cultural innovation based on this, introduction of
Yeah.
I mean, think of the Ramayana as you put it. They were sort of missing something. Right? They didn't have the artistic representation, and of course, they're ready for it because it's very important to them, and here it is.
Yeah.
It's I mean, that's the thing that struck me, and similarly, they're pretty into warfare, obviously, and then they see a culture which has a highly developed form of warfare that they value, so they.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in a way, it's funny that no one's ever done this before because it's actually built into our understanding of Southeast Asian studies. Because like Geertz's mandala, right, this notion of the theater state, which is that kings present their power through art, right? And the other thing that we know from this kind of cosmological notion of kingship is that Buddhist kings want to make a statement about their universality. So they are fit to rule all of the Buddhists of the world under their wing. And what I'm showing is that they self-consciously take on the artistic practices of other Buddhists that they capture, right? That's what's going on in these parades. That's what's going on in palace decoration, right? They're wanting to see this kind of mixture as a way of making a kind of global statement about the cosmopolitan nature and universality of their kingship. And so this thing that in, the history of Africans in the Americas, which I think you nicely summarized, right, is that, this gets called sometimes the miracle of African American history, which is that here are all these laws to kind of oppress African Americans. Their culture is actually stigmatized. There's laws to prevent miscegenation and cultural mixing, and yet the culture that they come up with is so compelling that it goes over and under these, walls, so that there's nothing left of pre-African American music in the Americas anymore. There's no popular music that is untouched, right? And globally, you can look at the music of Peru and Brazil, right? Jamaica, Haiti, all of the great musics of the world are from this creolized, interaction. And then you can go to dance, and you can go to painting and poetry and all of these ways that, the expressive arts born under the conditions of slavery spread out. But Southeast Asia, it wasn't subversive, right? There was a promotion of the culture of these captured people. So if we see it in the Americas, we should see it, at a factor of 10 or 20 times more in Southeast Asia, and that's kind of what I went digging around for.
Yeah. Wonder whether you would agree to this kind of comment. If you look at let's say different cultures, there will be high culture, low. Some civilizations have a higher culture, some have a lower culture. It seems that if the one with high culture is powerful, then usually the exchange of culture is that it would attract others to come in to learn from that. But if that's the one with more military power is actually of a lower culture, then it has to use force to capture the craftsmen from a higher culture into their own community.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's the case. Yeah. Is it? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one of I would say this about Burmese history. I would say Burmese culture is actually born out of this interaction. I hope this isn't too specific to Burma. I'm trying to be a little bit broader for everyone. But Burmese culture is very clearly born out of this long interactional history with the Mon, who were this potent and considered to be religiously superior in their practice of Buddhist group that kind of lived to the south of the Burmese, right, in the coast. And then the Shan, who are this upland mountain group who are ethnically Thai, but because they live in the mountains, they're called the Shan. And there's valleys up there, and they had kind of principalities. And food culture and religious culture, it's all this long interaction. But the thing about that is, you can't sort out slavery from it. They're taking slaves from each other, so that's going to be part of it. But there's also religious missions in which, and monks traveled with artisans back then, right, if they were going to build a temple. There's also what you're talking about, which is people looking for better jobs moving around within this sphere, and you get migrations to people moving back and forth because of some economic, some kind of maybe disaster or warfare, so you get refugees and you get migrants. It's all mixed together, and you can't pull slavery out of it. With Thailand you can, and with Manipur you can, because they were on the other side of a hostile border, right? So the only time Thais are ever in Mandalay is after these two wars, one in the 1580s and one in 1767, that took slaves because it's a long distance away. And the same is true for Manipur. There's just big mountains filled with headhunters that are between Manipur and Burma, and so they have diplomatic exchanges, but it's very limited. So that's why I can talk then about slavery, but the point that you're making is one that I think fits into this other dynamic, which is, I would say, the Mon, Burmese, Shan dynamic. And I mean, that's not something, I don't know, would you?
No, that's perfect.
Yeah, does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is kind of how I get away from what you're pointing to, which is just people moving between places, and just really isolate slavery by looking at these long distance, right? So I'm just looking at the long distance slave gathering. The other point that you're making is quite good too, though, which is that there just seems to be no interest. There's upland minorities, and in many parts of the world, that would be who you would capture as a slave, right? Because they're, am I gone over? Because I can wrap this up.
No, probably this would be less.
Okay, so this would be the last.
Uh-huh.
So you have upland minorities in Burma, and so these would be tribal peoples, not really politically organized. In many parts of the world, that's who you gather slaves from, right? And this is where coastal Africans gathered their slaves from, upland African groups who were less politically organized, to bring them down and then sell them on the coast. It's a common pattern. You don't really see it in Southeast Asia because they're interested in skilled labor. And so it is almost entirely the capturing of kind of other Buddhist kingdoms, and never a kind of going up into the uplands, right? It's just too much work. They can run away. There aren't very many of them, and they're not farmers. So even the basic level of anything that you'd want to do is to make them go and dig up new farm and grow rice, but that isn't what they grow up there. So they're kind of ignored, and that makes the pattern different. That's an interesting and different pattern. They're really only interested in skilled slaves, right? Because there isn't a kind of tobacco or cotton or some kind of manual labor interest that they have. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much,
Okay,
Bryce.
thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming.